Hi, my name is Ada Limón, and I'm here at the Library of Congress, and I am so pleased to be the new U.S. Poet Laureate. I know as a poet, you're supposed to have language for everything, but I think at that moment, words were a mystery to me. Yeah, I was overwhelmed. I felt as if there had been a mistake. and then I immediately really sunk into this feeling of complete gratitude. To be the next Poet Laureate is a huge honor, and I'm really excited not only to be in this position, but to recognize the legacy of the position. Of course, it's still settling in for me, it's new, but I think I really truly believe with my whole body in the power of poetry and in the power of poetry to heal and bring together communities and celebrate the interconnectedness that we all have with each other. And I think this is a huge opportunity to really honor those beliefs. I hope I can bring my whole self to the role in all of what that means in terms of my own sense of humanity, my heart, my sense of joy, and my belief in the fact that in order to find joy, we have to move through grief and sorrow. And so I think that, I hope, I'll bring my whole self and all of its complications and mess and its range of human emotions to this role. It's funny, I can almost remember always loving poetry, but I'm sure there was a moment. I think for me, the moment in which I thought, oh, this is something I've never encountered before and I might be obsessed with it, was at 15 when I read Elizabeth Bishop's poem One Art. It was on a test of all things. And I asked my teacher if I could keep the test because I wanted a copy of that poem. And of course, it's a poem, it's a love poem. It's a poem about loss and heartbreak. And I think that was a paradigm shift for me, even as a young person, as a 15-year-old, where I thought, I didn't know that you could talk about these things in this way and make a sort of music on the page. I really believe it's important to recognize that no one becomes an artist, or it's very rare, I should say, that people become artists without community, without someone in their lives supporting them, believing in them, taking that extra moment, taking them seriously. I have had that gift in my life. I've had that with all four of my parents, my step-parents included, with my siblings, and with my friends and family. And I think it's really important to remember that we don't make art alone. We make it in community. I think when I'm trying to get people to write or to get people to engage with poetry, one of the things I'm always saying is that if it feels like suffering to you to write, or if it feels like torture, maybe put it down for a little while. I think one of the misconceptions that we have about poetry is that if we sit down to write, we need to begin with the saddest thing, or we need to begin with the most traumatic thing that's ever happened to us. And I really believe that that work is important, and doing that work is important, but I also want to make room for joy, and I want to make room for pleasure. And I think that making poems can be a joyful thing. The way I make my poems is really listening to the voice underneath the voice. the self underneath the self, whatever it is, that core that is both me and not me. And I'm very interested in music and the way the rhythms and sounds shape the poem, the craft of the poem. But at the end of the day, I'm very interested in what it is that's the heart of the poem and what is pulsing, what's alive within it. And I think it's most interesting to me to make a poem that's a human thing. I think it's really important for me as an artist that when I compose, I use all my senses. It is a body experience. It's not just a mind experience. It has to be in the ear, in the mouth, in the senses, in the hands, in the heart, in the blood. And so for me, it's a whole body experience. And I don't know if that's true of every writer or every poet, but if it existed just up here, I don't think I'd have the same relationship to it. I think it needs to be in here, and it needs to be in here and here. It needs to have everything working together in order to make music. I find inspiration in so many different things. I always say the muse is, or my muse is the world. It's everything. But I think I'm always amazed by how deep attention can turn into a poem. That deep looking is a way of loving. And it can transform the smallest thing into something of great importance. And no matter how many years I've been writing poems and no matter what I've done, that is the thing that brings me the most joy, and it gives me shivers. The way that looking and attention and really giving your all to something can transform it. Do I have a favorite poem? That is hard. I think it's hard for me to answer because it always depends on the poem I need in the moment. If I'm having a rageful day, I might need to hear a rageful poem. And if I'm having a peaceful day, I might, want to sit down with a poem that's particularly meditative. So I think I really believe in the power of listening to your body and encouraging that poem to come to you and being receptive to it. And sometimes when I least expect it, a poem comes to me and I'm like, oh, this is the exact poem that I was supposed to hear right now. I love that moment. There's a poem by Robert Haas called Faint Music. And the first line of the poem is, maybe it's time to write a poem about grace. And I think about it all the time. And I set an intention every day when I wake up in the morning. Okay, this is my intention for the day. This is what I want to hold with me, whether it's busy, rushed, whatever's going on. And sometimes when I don't think of an intention and I'm sort of trying to gather my thoughts for the day, that line comes to me. Maybe it's time to write a poem about grace. I hadn't realized that I was so dependent upon reading poetry and being out in the world and hearing people's responses and feeling that sense of community. And so what I had to remind myself of is that I am in community even when I am isolated or even when I'm alone. And that community can be with my trees, the trees. I just said my. They're not my. The trees, the birds, the neighbors I can wave to from afar, the dogs in my life, all of that I am in community. I have enough community. I am connected without necessarily always being around people. And to me, that was a major, actually beautiful shift in my life. Because I recognized that we were going through this all together, whether it was the grief, whether it was isolation, whether it was sorrow, or whether it was also, having a nice time during that time when other people were suffering and trying to balance those two things. So I think it was really important to recognize that community isn't always meant that you have to be in the same room with someone else, right? But that it can be about being in partnership with the world. Yeah, poetry helped me more than ever during the pandemic. Because when we were talking about being in community, it felt like I could just pick up a book and there I was, there they were. Whether they were living or whether they were dead, they were still with me. And, I went a lot to the work of Audre Lorde, Lucille Clifton, Alejandra Pizarnik, and I kept feeling like they were calling to me and I was calling to them, and it wasn't necessarily a sort of ghost thing that was happening, but I definitely felt like there was a transmission that was happening, and I needed those poems. And of course, then all the contemporary poems I was reading were just blowing my mind. I think people are doing incredible work right now. And of course, writing poetry was harder. Reading was this incredible light, this incredible gift. And then writing it, there was a moment where I thought, what good is poetry, What good is poetry when we have this pandemic, when we have this reckoning, when I was feeling like there was this moment of the real limitations of language. And of course, when poetry was sort of forsaking me, or if you will, like I felt that it had left me, I wrote a poem about it. And that's when I knew I could get back into the world, and that language, of course, was still an anchor and a ladder out. The end of poetry. Enough of osseous and chickadee and sunflower and snowshoes, maple and seeds, samara and shoot. Enough chiaroscuro, enough of thus and prophecy and the stoic farmer and faith and our Father and 'tis of thee. Enough of bosom and bud, skin and God not forgetting and star bodies and frozen birds. Enough of the will to go on and not go on, or how a certain light does a certain thing. Enough of the kneeling and the rising and the looking inward and the looking up. Enough of the gun, the drama, and the acquaintance's suicide, the long-lost letter on the dresser. Enough of the longing and the ego and the obliteration of ego. Enough of the mother and the child and the father and the child. And enough of the pointing to the world, weary and desperate. Enough of the brutal and the border. Enough of can you see me? Can you hear me? Enough I am human. Enough I am alone and I am desperate. Enough of the animal saving me. Enough of the high water. Enough sorrow. Enough of the air and its ease. I am asking you to touch me. If we're thinking about how everything is about speed and access, right? It is sort of driven us to have this culture of more, this culture of desire, and never a culture of being satiated, never a culture of being full, and never a culture of having enough. And I think that those two things make space for poetry in this way, because poetry is enough. One poem is enough. And you're saying that you don't have a minute to read a poem, 2 minutes to read a poem? I mean, I think that that can be a beautiful thing. I also think it's important to remember that we live in a world where we have so many things that are on our to-do lists that we can never finish them all, right? I don't know about you, but I write many, many lists, and my body thinks that I can do so many things that I am not able to do in one day. But if I could read a poem and just say, I'm going to read a poem today, I felt like I've done something. I've completed something. And like meditation, like making a phone call to your grandmother, like checking in with your friends and family, whatever it is, it's that one moment of connection that can bring you back to who you are again, and to get you out of the hedonic treadmill of what's next, more, and instead just give you that small feeling of enoughness. And I think we really need that. I know I do. I think younger audiences are actually really interested in poetry, but I think we also have to make room for them to be interested in the poetry they like. And I think so often we have this idea that we will teach young people poetry as opposed to let them show us the poetry they are interested in. And I think that's a big part of, what we need to do in education in general, is that kind of listening. What is intriguing to you? What is interesting? What is interesting to you? And I also think when it comes to young people and teenagers, there is so much love for community, building community, and a sense of self at the same time that poetry thrives there. If you can open a door, they're going in. First of all, I think it's really important to remember that poetry really benefits if you can hear it out loud, right? I mean, for me, my favorite thing is to be read to. Someone will say, "Oh, can you read this poem?" And I'm always like, "Just read it to me," because I want to hear it out loud. And I'll do that with a book. If someone gives me a book of poems, the first thing I'll do is read out loud. It's why I can't work in cafes. And I write that way, and I work that way. And I think that providing different access to poetry to make sure that if you want to read it on the page, that's fine, but if you want to hear it, you have another access point. And I think that's really important to remember, that poetry can be presented in all sorts of forms. But I think it's essential that we remember that poetry has breath built into it. The line breaks, the caesuras, the stanza breaks. It has breath all around it. It literally wants us to breathe. It wants us to slow down. It wants us to stop. And I think we need that. I mean, how many of us need to just take a breath? There's that great Mary Oliver line, "Are you breathing just a little bit and calling it a life?" I mean, how many of us are living like that? And poetry allows us to breathe. I feel like poetry doesn't really need a marketer or a salesperson or a promoter. I think poetry is incredibly powerful, and I think when people can connect to it or given access to it, they will have their own experience. I don't want to tell anyone how they should relate to poetry, right? I want everyone to have their own experience with it. And that may mean, I don't like this poem, and it may mean, I really like that poem. But I think one of the greatest things about poetry is that it's one poem at a time. You can sample away, and you can decide which one really affects you, and you can decide which one is maybe not for you, or maybe will come back to you at a certain time. But I think poetry has all it needs, and I'll just be here to dance along beside it.